Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. It began with a faint creak, the kind of sound that could easily be dismissed as the settling of an old house. But for Clara, it was the first whisper of something far more sinister. She had moved into the Victorian-era home on the outskirts of Willowbrook just a week ago, drawn by its charm and the promise of solitude. The house was a sprawling structure with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and a history that the real estate agent had described as rich with character. Clara had laughed at the time, thinking it was just a sales pitch. Now she wasn't so sure. The hallway in question was on the second floor, leading to the master bedroom. It was a narrow passage, lined with faded wallpaper that bore a pattern of ivy and roses, their colors muted by decades of sunlight. At night, the hallway was dimly lit by a single, flickering sconce that cast long, wavering shadows on the walls. Clara had noticed nothing unusual at first, just the usual quirks of an old house. But then on the third night, she saw it. She had been returning to her bedroom after a late-night glass of water when she paused, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Something felt off. The hallway seemed longer than she remembered. She shook her head, blaming her tired eyes, and continued to her room. But the next morning, as she walked the length of the hallway, she counted her steps. 20, just as she had expected. That night, however, when she repeated the count, it took her 25 steps to reach her door. Clara's heart began to race. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick of the light or her mind playing games. But the following night, the hallway stretched even further. 30 steps, then 35. Each night, the hallway grew longer, and the shadows seemed to deepen, as if they were alive and watching her. Desperate for answers, Clara began to research the house's history. She visited the local library, scoured old newspapers, and even spoke to a few elderly residents of Willowbrook. What she uncovered was a chilling tale. The house had been built in 1887 by a reclusive inventor named Elias Hargrove. Hargrove was known for his eccentricities and his obsession with the concept of infinity. He had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1893, leaving behind a house filled with strange contraptions and blueprints for devices that no one could fully understand. One of the elderly townsfolk, a woman named Mrs. Thompson, recalled a story her grandmother had told her. They say Hargrove was trying to build a doorway to another world, she said, her voice trembling. But something went wrong. The hallway in that house, it's not right. It's alive. Clara's unease grew with each passing night. The hallway was now so long that she could barely see the end of it. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if breathing, and the air was thick with a metallic scent that made her nauseous. She tried to avoid the hallway altogether, sleeping on the couch in the living room, but no matter where she went in the house, she would wake up in her bedroom, the hallway stretching endlessly before her. One night, driven by a mix of fear and determination, Clara decided to confront whatever was happening. She armed herself with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, though she doubted either would be of much use. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt the floor shift beneath her feet, as if it were alive. The walls seemed to close in, then expand, like the ribs of some great beast. The flickering sconce went out, plunging her into darkness. Clara turned on her flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the thick gloom. She began to walk, counting her steps as she went. 50, 60, 70. The hallway seemed to go on forever, the walls now covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. She could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from all around her. They grew louder as she walked until they were a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once in a language she couldn't understand. At the 100th step, Clara stopped. The hallway had changed. The walls were no longer made of wood and wallpaper, but of some dark, pulsating material that felt warm to the touch. The air was thick and heavy, and the whispers had become screams. She turned to go back, but the hallway behind her was gone, replaced by an endless void. Panic set in. Clara ran, her footsteps echoing in the suffocating darkness. The hallway seemed to twist and writhe around her, the floor buckling and rising like waves. She stumbled and fell, the knife slipping from her hand. When she looked up, she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by shadow. It beckoned to her, its long, spindly fingers curling in a grotesque imitation of a wave. Clara screamed, but no sound came out. The figure began to move toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. She scrambled to her feet and ran in the opposite direction. But the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. The walls closed in, the whispers became a deafening roar, and the figure was suddenly right behind her, its cold breath on her neck. She woke up in her bed, drenched in sweat, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But then she saw the mud on her feet and the scratches on her arms. The hallway was back to its normal length, but the air was heavy with the scent of metal, and the walls seemed to hum faintly. Clara knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed her bags and left that same day, vowing never to return. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't done with her. In the rearview mirror, she thought she saw the figure standing in the doorway, its head tilted to one side, watching her go. The house still stands on the outskirts of Willowbrook, empty and silent. But at night, if you listen closely, you can hear the faint creak of the hallway growing longer, in the whispers of something that should not be. And if you're foolish enough to step inside, you might find yourself walking down a hallway that never ends, toward a figure that waits in the dark, its fingers curling in a grotesque wave. It was a rainy afternoon when Eleanor first saw the doll. She had been wandering through the narrow, winding streets of Blackthorn, a quaint village nestled deep in the English countryside. The village was known for its antique shops, each one a treasure trove of forgotten relics and curiosities. Eleanor, an avid collector of oddities, couldn't resist the allure of these shops. She had a particular fondness for dolls. The older and more peculiar, the better. The shop that caught her eye was tucked away in a shadowy corner of the village, its windows fogged with age and its sign barely legible. Blackthorn Antiques and Curios. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside, the scent of dust and old wood filling her nostrils. The shop was dimly lit, its shelves crammed with an assortment of objects: porcelain figurines, tarnished silverware, yellowed books, and, of course, dolls. It was the doll in the corner that drew her attention. It sat on a high shelf, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead. The doll was about 2 feet tall, with porcelain skin that had yellowed with age. Its hair was a cascade of dark curls, and it wore a tattered dress of faded blue silk. But what struck Eleanor most was its expression. The doll's lips were curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, as if it knew something she didn't. "Ah, I see you found her," came a voice from behind her. Eleanor turned to see an elderly man with a stooped posture and a pair of thick spectacles perched on his nose. He was the shopkeeper, and his eyes twinkled with a strange intensity as he looked at the doll. "She's fascinating," Eleanor said, unable to tear her gaze away from the doll. "How old is she?" "Oh, she's quite old," the shopkeeper replied, his voice low and measured. "Early 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. She's been in this shop for as long as I can remember, waiting for the right person to take her home." Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine, but she couldn't explain why. There was something about the doll that called to her, something she couldn't resist. "How much is she?" she asked. The shopkeeper hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "For you, my dear, she's free. But I must warn you, this doll is not like the others. She has a history." Eleanor frowned. "What kind of history?" The shopkeeper's expression darkened. "Let's just say she's been known to whisper things, secrets, things that should never be spoken aloud. Some say she's cursed. Others say she's a vessel for something far more sinister." Eleanor laughed nervously. "You're just trying to scare me, aren't you?" The shopkeeper's eyes bore into hers. "Take her if you wish, but remember, you've been warned." Despite the shopkeeper's ominous words, Eleanor couldn't resist. She took the doll home, carefully wrapping it in a cloth and placing it in her bag. As she left the shop, she thought she heard the faintest whisper, but when she turned around, the shopkeeper was gone and the door was closed. That night, Eleanor placed the doll on a shelf in her study next to her other collectibles. She sat at her desk, sipping tea and reading a book, when she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was coming from the doll. "Eleanor," the voice whispered, so faint it could have been her imagination. But it wasn't. The voice was real, and it was coming from the doll. She stood up, her hands trembling, and approached the doll. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she drew closer. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The doll's lips didn't move, but the voice came again, louder this time. "I know your secrets, Eleanor. I know what you've done." Eleanor stumbled back, her mind racing. What was happening? Was she losing her mind? She grabbed the doll and shoved it into a drawer, slamming it shut. But even through the woods, she could hear the whispers, faint and insidious. The next few days were a blur. The whispers grew louder, more persistent. They spoke of things Eleanor had buried deep in her past, things she had never told anyone, secrets she had sworn to take to her grave. The doll knew them all. "You lied to him," the doll whispered one night, its voice echoing in the darkness. "You told him you loved him, but you didn't. You just wanted his money." Eleanor clutched her pillow, tears streaming down her face. "Stop it," she begged. "Please, just stop." But the doll didn't stop. It whispered of the times she had betrayed her best friend, spreading rumors that ruined her reputation. It whispered of the lies she had told to get ahead in her career, the people she had hurt along the way. It whispered of the darkest corners of her soul, things she had tried to forget. Desperate for relief, Eleanor returned to the antique shop, but it was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. She asked the villagers about the shopkeeper, but no one knew who she was talking about. It was as if the shop had never existed. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They began to invade her dreams, turning them into nightmares. She saw herself as a child, standing in a dark room, the doll in her hands. But it wasn't her. It was someone else. Someone with her face, but not her soul. The doll whispered to that other Eleanor, and she listened, her eyes wide with fear. One night, Eleanor couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed the doll and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. The porcelain cracked and blackened, the silk dress turning to ash. But as the flames died down, she heard the whisper one last time. "You can't escape me, Eleanor. I'll always be with you." The next morning, Eleanor woke up to find the doll sitting on her bedside table, its glassy eyes staring at her, its lips curled into that faint, knowing smile. She screamed, but no sound came out. The doll whispered again, its voice soft and mocking. "You belong to me now." Eleanor tried to leave the house, but the doors were locked. The windows wouldn't open. The doll's whispers filled the air, drowning out her thoughts. She collapsed to the floor, her hands over her ears, but the whispers only grew louder. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor became a prisoner in her own home. The doll never left her side, its whispers a constant reminder of her sins. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Her reflection in the mirror became a stranger, her eyes hollow and haunted. One night, as the whispers reached a crescendo, Eleanor made a decision. She took the doll in her hands and climbed to the top of the stairs. With a cry of desperation, she hurled it down, watching as it shattered into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, there was silence. Then the whispers began again, louder and more menacing than ever. They came from all around her, from the walls, the floor, the air itself. Eleanor sank to her knees, her mind unraveling. The last thing she saw was the doll's face, its shattered pieces reassembling themselves, its lips curling into that faint, knowing smile. When the authorities found Eleanor's body weeks later, they assumed she had died of natural causes. The house was empty, save for a single doll sitting on the mantelpiece, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead, its lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. And if you listen closely, they say, you can still hear the whispers. It started with a dream, a vivid, unsettling dream that lingered in the corners of Daniel's mind long after he woke. In the dream, he stood in a vast, empty room with walls the color of ash. The air was thick and heavy, and the only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock. He couldn't see the clock, but he could feel its presence, a weight pressing down on him, counting down to something he couldn't understand. When Daniel opened his eyes, the ticking didn't stop. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, echoing in the silence of his bedroom. He sat up, his heart pounding, and looked around. The room was empty, the only clock a digital alarm on his nightstand, its numbers glowing faintly in the dark. But the ticking wasn't coming from there. It was coming from inside his head. He shook it off, blaming it on stress or lack of sleep. But the next night, the dream returned. This time, the room was different. A long, narrow hallway with high vaulted ceilings. The walls were lined with clocks of every shape and size, their hands moving in unison, ticking in perfect harmony. At the end of the hallway stood a massive grandfather clock, its face obscured by shadows. The ticking grew louder as Daniel approached, each step echoing in the silence. When he reached the clock, he saw that its face was blank, save for a single hand that moved steadily backward, counting down. The numbers were strange, unfamiliar symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. He reached out to touch the clock, but as his fingers brushed the glass, he woke up. The ticking followed him into the waking world, louder this time, more insistent. It was as if the clock had taken up residence in his mind, its relentless countdown a constant reminder of something he couldn't quite grasp. He tried to ignore it, to push it to the back of his mind, but it was always there, a steady, unyielding presence. Over the next few days, the dreams grew more intense, more vivid. Each night, he found himself in a different room, each one filled with clocks that ticked in unison, their hands moving backward, counting down to something. The grandfather clock was always there, its face blank, its single hand moving steadily backward. And each night, the ticking grew louder, more insistent, until it was all he could hear, even when he was awake. Desperate for answers, Daniel began to research. He spent hours online, searching for anything that might explain the dreams, the ticking, the countdown. He found stories of people who had experienced similar dreams, but they were few and far between, and none of them offered any real answers. He visited a sleep specialist who suggested it might be stress or anxiety, but Daniel knew it was more than that. This was something else, something deeper. One night, the dream changed. He found himself in a room he recognized, his childhood home. The walls were lined with clocks, their hands moving backward, ticking in unison. The grandfather clock stood in the corner, its face blank, its single hand moving steadily backward. But this time, there was something else. A figure standing in the shadows watching him. Daniel's heart raced as he approached the figure. It was a man, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a face that seemed to shift and change, as if it were made of smoke. The man didn't speak, but Daniel could feel his presence, a cold, oppressive weight that pressed down on him. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the grandfather clock. The ticking grew louder, more insistent, and Daniel felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. He looked at the clock, its single hand moving steadily backward, and realized with a start that the countdown was almost over. He woke up in a cold sweat, the ticking echoing in his ears. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know what. The dreams were getting worse, more intense, and he could feel the countdown drawing closer, like a noose tightening around his neck. The next day, Daniel decided to visit his childhood home. It had been years since he'd been there, but he felt a strange pull, as if the house held the answers he was looking for. The drive was long, and by the time he arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The house looked exactly as he remembered it. A large, imposing structure with peeling paint and broken windows. It had been abandoned for years, but as Daniel approached, he felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if he had never left. He pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with clocks, just like in his dreams. Their hands moved backward, ticking in unison, and the ticking grew louder as he walked through the house, each step echoing in the silence. At the end of the hallway, he found the grandfather clock. It stood in the corner, its face blank, its single hand moving steadily backward. The ticking was deafening now, a steady, unyielding rhythm that seemed to vibrate through his entire body. Daniel approached the clock, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out to touch it, but as his fingers brushed the glass, the ticking stopped. The room fell silent, and for a moment, Daniel thought it was over. But then the clock began to chime, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The room began to spin, the walls closing in, and Daniel felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of vertigo. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. When the spinning stopped, Daniel found himself in a place he didn't recognize. It was a vast, empty space with no walls, no ceiling, no floor, just endless darkness. The only thing he could see was the grandfather clock, its face now glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. The single hand had stopped moving, and the countdown was over. The figure from his dreams appeared, standing in front of the clock. His hollow eyes bore into Daniel's, and his voice echoed in the silence. "Time's up," the figure said, his voice cold and emotionless. Daniel tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but the figure raised a hand, and Daniel felt a sudden, searing pain in his chest. He looked down and saw that his body was beginning to dissolve, his flesh turning to ash, drifting away into the darkness. The last thing he saw was the grandfather clock, its face glowing brighter and brighter, until the light consumed everything. When Daniel woke up, he was back in his bedroom. The ticking was gone, and the room was silent. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream, a terrible, vivid dream. But as he sat up, he noticed something strange. His hands were pale, almost translucent, and when he looked in the mirror, his reflection was gone. The ticking started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Daniel realized with a sinking feeling that the countdown wasn't over. It had just begun, and this time, there was no escape. The clock had claimed him, and he was now a part of its endless, relentless countdown. In the heart of the ancient city of Barrenwood, where cobblestone streets wound like serpents through a labyrinth of Gothic spires and shadowed alleyways, there lived a violinist named Alara Voss. Her music was said to be unlike any other, a haunting, ethereal sound that seemed to transcend the boundaries of the mortal world. It was whispered among the townsfolk that her melodies could summon spirits, drawing them from the veil between life and death to dance in the moonlight. But Alara herself never spoke of such things. She played her violin in the town square every evening, her eyes closed, her soul pouring into the strings, as if she were communing with something or someone beyond the reach of the living. Alara had come to Varenwood 5 years ago, a mysterious figure with no past and no family. She carried only her violin, an antique instrument with a deep, rich tone, and a body carved with intricate runes that no one could decipher. The townsfolk were wary of her at first, but her music quickly won them over. It was said that her playing could soothe the most troubled heart, bring tears to the eyes of the stoic, and even heal the sick. But there were darker rumors too, rumors of strange occurrences that followed her performances. Flickering lanterns, cold drafts in warm rooms, and the faint sound of whispers when no one was around. Alara herself was an enigma. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were cryptic, as if she carried a weight too heavy to share. She lived in a small, crumbling cottage on the edge of the forest, far from the bustle of the town. The cottage was surrounded by an overgrown garden, its iron gate rusted and creaking in the wind. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves filled with strange artifacts, ancient books, jars of dried herbs, and shards of glass that seemed to catch the light in unnatural ways. But the most striking feature of the cottage was the portrait that hung above the fireplace, a painting of a man with piercing blue eyes and a sorrowful expression. No one knew who he was, but Alara would often stare at the portrait for hours, her fingers absently tracing the strings of her violin. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Alara took her usual place in the town square. The air was thick with the scent of blooming night flowers, and the crowd that gathered to hear her play was larger than usual. She closed her eyes, lifted her bow, and began to play. The melody that flowed from her violin was unlike anything the townsfolk had ever heard. It was a song of longing and loss, of love and betrayal, of life and death. The notes seemed to hang in the air, shimmering like ghosts, and as the music swelled, a strange thing happened. The lanterns that lined the square flickered and dimmed, and a cold wind swept through the crowd, sending shivers down their spines. The air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to deepen, as if the night itself were alive. And then they appeared. At first, they were just faint outlines, shimmering like heat waves in the distance. But as Alara's music grew more intense, the outlines became clearer, taking on the shapes of people, men, women, and children, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. They moved in time with the music, their forms flickering like candle flames, their feet barely touching the ground. The townsfolk gasped and stepped back, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. But Alara played on, her eyes still closed, her face a mask of concentration. The spirits danced around her, their movements graceful and fluid, as if they were caught in a trance. Some of them reached out to the living, their translucent hands brushing against cheeks and shoulders, sending chills through those they touched. Others simply watched, their expressions a mixture of sadness and longing. And then, as the final note of the song faded into the night, the spirits began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart like smoke in the wind until they were gone. The square was silent, the crowd too stunned to speak. Alara lowered her violin and opened her eyes, her face pale and drawn. She looked out at the crowd, her gaze distant, as if she were seeing something they couldn't. And then, without a word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alleyways. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, their voices filled with awe and fear. Some claimed that Alara was a witch, that her music was a form of dark magic. Others believed she was a conduit for the spirits, a bridge between the living and the dead. But no one dared to ask her directly. They were too afraid of what she might say or what she might summon. That night, Alara returned to her cottage, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done. She sat by the fireplace, staring at the portrait of the man with the piercing blue eyes, her fingers absently tracing the strings of her violin. She knew that the spirits she had summoned were not just random souls. They were the lost, the forgotten, the ones who had been wronged in life and could not find peace in death. And she knew that her music was the key to unlocking their stories, to giving them a voice. But there was one spirit she had been searching for, one soul that had eluded her for years. It was the spirit of the man in the portrait, her beloved Lucian. He had been taken from her long ago, his life cut short by a betrayal that had left her heartbroken and alone. She had spent years searching for a way to bring him back, to hear his voice one more time, to feel his touch. And now she was closer than ever. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Alara lifted her violin and began to play. The melody was soft and mournful, a song of love and loss, of hope and despair. The notes filled the room, wrapping around her like a shroud. And as the music grew more intense, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. And then she felt it, a presence, faint but unmistakable. She opened her eyes and saw him standing there, his form shimmering like moonlight on water. It was Lucian, his blue eyes filled with sorrow, his hand reaching out to her. Alara's heart ached as she reached for him, her fingers brushing against his, but they passed through him like smoke. "Lucian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've missed you so much." He smiled a sad, gentle smile and spoke, his voice a faint echo. "Alara, my love, you must let me go. I cannot stay." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. "No, I can't. I can't lose you again." "You must," he said, his voice growing fainter. "My time here is over, but yours is not. Live, Alara. Live for both of us." And then he was gone, his form dissolving into the air, leaving her alone once more. Alara sat in silence, her heart heavy with grief and relief. She knew that Lucian was right, that she had to let him go, to move on with her life. But she also knew that her music would always be a bridge to the other side, a way to honor the lost and the forgotten. From that night on, Alara's music changed. It was still haunting, still beautiful, but there was a new lightness to it, a sense of hope and healing. She continued to play in the town square, and though the spirits still came, they were no longer restless or sorrowful. They danced in the moonlight, their forms shimmering like stars. When the music ended, they faded away, their souls at peace. And Alara, though she still carried the weight of her past, found a new purpose in her music, a way to bring light to the darkness, to heal the wounds of the living and the dead alike. She became a legend in Varenwood, the violinist whose music could summon spirits. But she was more than that. She was a healer, a guide, a bridge between worlds. And though she never spoke of Lucian again, she knew that he was always with her, in every note she played, in every melody that flowed from her heart. And in that, she found peace. Deep in the heart of the Blackwood forest, where the trees grew so thick that sunlight rarely touched the ground, there lay a lake unlike any other. Its waters were a deep, unnatural blue, so still that they seemed more like glass than liquid. The locals called it Mirror Lake, but not because of its reflective surface. They called it that because of what lay beneath. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of frozen souls trapped in the icy depths, their faces forever preserved in expressions of terror, sorrow, or despair. The lake was shrouded in mystery and fear. No one knew how it had come to be or why it had the power to freeze souls. Some said it was cursed by a vengeful spirit. Others believed it was a gateway to the underworld, and a few whispered that it was alive, a sentient force that fed on the pain and suffering of those who dared to approach it. Whatever the truth, the lake was avoided by all but the most desperate or the most foolish. For centuries, the lake had been a place of whispered warnings and dark legends. Parents told their children to stay away, lest they be lured by its eerie beauty and never return. Travelers who passed through the forest would go miles out of their way to avoid it, and even animals seemed to sense its malevolence, giving it a wide berth. But despite the warnings, there were always those who were drawn to the lake, driven by curiosity, grief, or a desire to uncover its secrets. One such person was a young woman named Isolde. She had come to Blackwood Forest in search of answers. Her twin brother Elias had vanished a year ago, and the last place he had been seen was near the lake. The authorities had given up the search after a few weeks, declaring him lost to the wilderness, but Isolde refused to believe it. She had always felt a strange connection to her brother, a bond that went beyond the physical, and she was certain that he was still alive, or at least that his soul was. Isolde was no stranger to the supernatural. She had grown up in a family of healers and mystics, and she had inherited their gifts. She could sense things that others couldn't, echoes of the past, whispers of the future, and the presence of spirits. It was this gift that had led her to the lake, and as she stood on its shore, staring into its icy depths, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The lake was even more unsettling up close. Its surface was perfectly smooth, reflecting the dark trees and the pale moon like a mirror. But beneath the surface, something moved. Shadows that twisted and writhed, shapes that seemed almost human. Isolde knelt by the water's edge, her breath visible in the frigid air, and reached out a hand. The moment her fingers touched the water, a jolt of icy pain shot through her, and she yanked her hand back, gasping. But the pain was nothing compared to what she saw next. As the ripples from her touch spread across the surface, the water began to clear, revealing what lay beneath. Frozen in the ice were faces, dozens of them, their eyes wide and unseeing, their mouths open in silent screams. Isolde's heart raced as she recognized one of them. It was Elias. His face was pale and gaunt, his expression one of pure terror. His hands were pressed against the ice, as if he had been trying to break free. But the frozen water had claimed him. Isolde's breath caught in her throat, and she reached out again, this time pressing her palm against the surface. The cold was unbearable, but she didn't pull away. She closed her eyes and focused, calling on her gift to reach out to her brother. At first there was nothing but silence, but then faintly she heard it, a voice so soft it was almost inaudible. It was Elias. "Isolde," the voice whispered, filled with pain and longing. "Help me." Tears streamed down Isolde's face as she pressed her hand harder against the ice. "I'm here, Elias," she whispered back. "I'm going to save you." But as she spoke, the lake began to change. The water grew darker, the shadows beneath the surface twisting and writhing more violently. The air grew colder, and the wind began to howl, carrying with it the sound of distant screams. Isolde felt a presence behind her, a weight pressing down on her, and she turned to see a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was a woman, tall and slender, with long flowing hair the color of snow. Her skin was pale as ice, and her eyes were a piercing, unnatural blue. She wore a gown made of frost, and as she moved, the ground beneath her feet froze, leaving a trail of ice in her wake. She smiled at Isolde, but it was a cold, cruel smile, devoid of warmth or kindness. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman said, her voice like the crackling of ice. "This is no place for the living." Isolde stood, her heart pounding, but she refused to back down. "Who are you?" she demanded. The woman's smile widened. "I am the guardian of this lake, the keeper of the frozen souls. And you, my dear, have trespassed on my domain." Isolde's mind raced. She had heard stories of the lake's guardian, a spirit or demon who lured the unwary to their doom. But she had never believed them until now. "I've come for my brother," Isolde said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I won't leave without him." The guardian's eyes narrowed and she stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Your brother is mine now," she said, "just as you will be if you do not leave." Isolde shook her head. "I'm not afraid of you." The guardian laughed, a sound like breaking ice. "You should be." With a wave of her hand, the guardian sent a blast of icy wind toward Isolde, knocking her off her feet. Isolde scrambled to her knees, her hands numb from the cold, but she refused to give up. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small vial of liquid, a potion she had made before coming to the lake, a mixture of herbs and oils designed to ward off evil spirits. She threw the vial at the guardian, and it shattered at her feet, releasing a cloud of fragrant smoke. The guardian hissed, her form flickering like a flame in the wind, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she lunged at Isolde, her icy fingers closing around her throat. Isolde gasped, her vision darkening as the cold seeped into her bones. But just as she was about to lose consciousness, she heard Elias's voice again, louder this time. "Isolde, fight her!" Summoning the last of her strength, Isolde reached into her bag again and pulled out a small silver dagger, a family heirloom, said to be blessed by the spirits. She plunged the dagger into the guardian's chest, and the woman let out a piercing scream, her form shattering like glass. The lake erupted in a frenzy of ice and water, the frozen souls beneath the surface writhing and twisting as if trying to break free. Isolde stumbled to her feet, her body trembling from the cold, and ran to the edge of the lake. She pressed her hands against the ice, calling out to Elias, "Elias, I'm here! Take my hand!" For a moment, nothing happened. But then, she felt a warmth spreading through the ice, and Elias's hand broke through the surface, grasping hers. With all her strength, Isolde pulled, and slowly, painfully, Elias emerged from the lake, his body shaking and his skin pale, but alive. The two siblings collapsed on the shore, holding each other as the lake grew still once more. The guardian was gone, her presence erased, and the frozen souls beneath the surface were at peace. Isolde and Elias left the forest that night, never to return. But the lake remained, its waters still and silent, waiting for the next soul to be lured by its eerie beauty. And though the guardian was gone, the lake's power remained, a reminder that some places are best left untouched, and some secrets are best left buried. In the quiet, forgotten town of Eldridge, nestled deep within a valley surrounded by dense, ancient forests, there stood an old, dilapidated mansion known as Blackthorn Manor. The mansion had been abandoned for over a century, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. Locals whispered tales of its dark history, of a family that had vanished without a trace, of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, and of a cursed object that was said to reside within its walls. That object was a mirror, an ornate full-length mirror with a frame carved from blackened oak, adorned with intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The mirror had been brought to Blackthorn Manor in the late 1800s by the family patriarch, Victor Blackthorn, a wealthy and eccentric collector of rare artifacts. He had acquired it during one of his many travels abroad, though the details of its origins were shrouded in mystery. Some said it had been crafted by a reclusive artisan in the mountains of Eastern Europe, while others claimed it was a relic from a long-lost civilization. Whatever its true history, the The mirror quickly became the centerpiece of the manor's grand hall, its surface gleaming with an almost otherworldly sheen. But not long after the mirror's arrival, strange things began to happen. Servants reported seeing shadowy figures moving within its depths, figures that did not belong to the reflection of the room. Victor's wife, Eleanor, claimed to have seen a woman in Victorian dress staring back at her, her eyes filled with sorrow. Their children, too, began to speak of seeing people in the mirror, people who were not there when they turned to look. The family grew increasingly uneasy, and Victor eventually ordered the mirror to be covered with a heavy cloth, hoping to put an end to the unsettling occurrences. But the mirror's influence could not be so easily contained. One by one, the Blackthorne family members began to disappear. First, it was Eleanor, who vanished one night without a trace. Then the children, who were never seen again. Victor, driven to madness by grief and fear, locked himself in the manor, refusing to leave. When the townsfolk finally mustered the courage to investigate, they found the mansion empty, its halls echoing with an eerie silence. The mirror, however, remained, its surface as pristine as ever, as if untouched by the passage of time. For decades, the mirror sat undisturbed in the decaying manor, its secrets hidden behind layers of dust and cobwebs. But as the years passed, the stories of the haunted mirror began to fade, becoming little more than a local legend, a tale told to frightened children on dark nights. That is, until a young woman named Clara Hastings arrived in Eldridge. Clara was a historian, specializing in the preservation of historical artifacts. She had come to Eldridge to document the town's history and to explore the ruins of Blackthorne Manor, which had recently been purchased by a developer with plans to restore it. Clara had heard the stories of the haunted mirror, of course, but she dismissed them as mere superstition. To her, the mirror was a fascinating piece of history, a relic of a bygone era that deserved to be studied and preserved. On a crisp autumn morning, Clara made her way to Blackthorne Manor, her footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves that littered the overgrown path. The mansion loomed before her, its windows dark and lifeless, its walls covered in ivy. She pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside, her breath visible in the cold, musty air. The grand hall was just as she had imagined it, ornate but decaying, with peeling wallpaper and a chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. And there, at the far end of the room, stood the mirror. Clara approached it slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and unease. The mirror was even more beautiful than she had anticipated, its frame a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its surface still remarkably clear despite the years of neglect. She reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the cool glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if in response to her touch, the mirror's surface rippled like water, and Clara stumbled back in shock. When she looked again, the reflection of the room was gone. In its place was a scene from another time, a grand ballroom filled with people in Victorian attire, their faces frozen in expressions of joy and laughter. Clara blinked, convinced she was imagining things, but the image remained. She stepped closer, her eyes wide with wonder, and as she did, the figures in the mirror seemed to notice her. They turned to look at her, their eyes filled with curiosity, and one of them, a woman in a flowing gown, stepped forward, her lips moving as if to speak. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could hear faint whispers, though the words were indistinct, as if coming from a great distance. The woman in the mirror reached out, her hand pressing against the glass, and Clara felt an inexplicable urge to do the same. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling, and as they touched the mirror's surface, a jolt of energy surged through her, pulling her forward. The world around her blurred, and for a moment, she felt as though she were falling. When her vision cleared, she found herself standing in the ballroom, surrounded by the people she had seen in the mirror. They were no longer silent. Their voices filled the air, a cacophony of laughter and conversation. The woman in the gown stood before her, her expression one of both surprise and relief. "Welcome," the woman said, her voice soft but clear. "We have been waiting for you." Clara's mind raced. She had no idea how she had come to be here, in this place that seemed to exist outside of time. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor Blackthorne, and as Clara listened to her story, she began to piece together the truth. The mirror was not just a reflection of another time. It was a gateway, a portal that connected the present to the past. The Blackthorne family had not vanished. They had been trapped within the mirror, their souls bound to its magic. Eleanor explained that the mirror had been cursed by its creator, a man who had sought to preserve the souls of his loved ones after their deaths. But the curse had gone awry, trapping not only the dead but also the living, creating a liminal space where time had no meaning. The Blackthorns had been its first victims, but over the years others had been drawn into its depths, their reflections captured forever. Clara realized that she, too, was now trapped. The mirror had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others. But unlike the Blackthorns, who had resigned themselves to their fate, Clara was determined to find a way out. She spent what felt like days, or perhaps weeks, exploring the mirror's world, searching for a way to break the curse. She spoke to the other trapped souls, learning their stories and uncovering the mirror's secrets. Finally, she discovered the truth. The mirror's curse could only be broken by someone from the outside, someone who could see the mirror for what it truly was, and who had the strength to resist its pull. Clara knew that she could not do it alone, but she also knew that she could not stay. With a heavy heart, she bid farewell to Eleanor and the others, promising to find a way to free them. As she focused her thoughts on the present, on the world she had left behind, the ballroom began to fade, and Clara felt herself being pulled back through the mirror. She emerged in the grand hall of Blackthorne Manor, her body trembling with exhaustion. The mirror's surface was still once more, its reflections ordinary and unchanging. Clara knew that she had been given a second chance, but she also knew that her work was far from over. The mirror's curse still loomed, a threat to anyone who dared to gaze into its depths. She vowed to uncover the mirror's origins, to find a way to break the curse and free the souls trapped within. And as she left Blackthorne Manor, the mirror watched her go, its surface shimmering with a faint, otherworldly light, as if it knew that its secrets were not yet safe. From that day forward, Clara dedicated her life to studying the mirror and others like it, traveling the world in search of answers. She became a renowned expert on cursed artifacts, though she never spoke of her own experience within the mirror. And though she never returned to Blackthorne Manor, she often found herself thinking of Eleanor and the others, their faces forever etched in her memory. The haunted mirror remained in the manor, its secrets hidden behind its gleaming surface, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to gaze into its depths. And though Clara had escaped, she knew that the mirror's curse was far from broken. Somewhere in another time, the ballroom still stood, its inhabitants trapped in an endless dance, their reflections waiting to be freed. In the heart of the bustling city of Veridon, where the streets were always alive with the hum of activity and the air was thick with the scent of street food and exhaust fumes, there existed a small, unassuming antique shop tucked away in a narrow alley. The shop, known as Eldritch Relics, was a place of mystery and intrigue, its windows filled with an eclectic array of curiosities, ancient books, strange trinkets, and artifacts from distant lands. The shop's owner, an elderly man named Mr. Alaric, was a figure of equal mystery, his eyes always gleaming with a knowing light, as if he held secrets too vast to be spoken. Among the many oddities in the shop, there was one item that stood out, though it was often overlooked by casual browsers. It was a mask, crafted from a material that seemed to shift and change under the light, its surface a swirling blend of shadows and smoke. The mask was simple in design, with no ornate carvings or embellishments. Yet it exuded an aura of power, a sense of something ancient and otherworldly. A small faded tag hung from it, bearing the words, "The Mask of Shadows. Beware the price of invisibility." The mask had been in the shop for as long as anyone could remember, its origins unknown. Mr. Alaric would often tell curious customers that it was a relic from a forgotten civilization, a tool used by shamans to communicate with the spirit world. But he would always caution them against trying it on, his voice low and serious. "The mask grants its wearer the ability to become invisible to the living," he would say, "but such power comes at a cost. Once you put it on, you may never be able to take it off." Most people dismissed his warnings as mere theatrics, the ramblings of an old man trying to add mystique to his wares. But there were a few who were drawn to the mask, their curiosity piqued by the promise of invisibility. Among them was a young man named Daniel Harper. Daniel was a struggling artist, his days spent working a mundane office job to make ends meet, his nights devoted to his true passion, painting. But despite his talent, he had yet to achieve the recognition he craved. He felt invisible in the crowded city, his voice drowned out by the noise of a world that seemed to have no place for him. When he first saw the Mask of Shadows in Eldritch Relics, something about it called to him, a whisper in the back of his mind that he couldn't ignore. One evening, after a particularly discouraging day at work, Daniel found himself standing outside the shop, the mask's tag clutched in his hand. He had purchased it on a whim, drawn by the promise of escape, of becoming unseen in a world that had always overlooked him. Mr. Alaric had tried to dissuade him, his eyes filled with a strange sadness. But Daniel had insisted, handing over the money with a determined smile. Now standing in the dim light of his small apartment, Daniel held the mask in his hands, its surface cool to the touch. He hesitated for a moment, the old man's warnings echoing in his mind. But the desire to disappear, to escape the weight of his failures, was too strong. With a deep breath, he lifted the mask to his face and put it on. At first, nothing happened. The mask fit snugly against his skin, its material strangely comforting. Then slowly he began to feel a change. The air around him seemed to grow colder, the sounds of the city outside fading into a distant hum. He looked down at his hands and gasped. They were fading, becoming translucent, as if he were turning into a ghost. Panic surged through him, and he reached up to remove the mask, but his fingers passed through it as if it were made of smoke. "No!" he cried, his voice echoing strangely in the empty room. He stumbled to the mirror, his heart pounding, and stared at his reflection, or rather, the lack of it. The mask was there, its shadowy surface covering his face, but the rest of him was gone, invisible to the world. For a moment, Daniel stood frozen, his mind racing. Then a strange sense of calm washed over him. He was invisible. No one could see him. No one could judge him. He was free. A smile spread across his face, hidden beneath the mask, and he stepped out into the night, eager to explore his newfound power. At first, the experience was exhilarating. Daniel wandered the streets, unseen and unheard, observing the world from a new perspective. He watched people going about their lives, their faces filled with emotions he could now see clearly: joy, sadness, anger, love. He felt like a ghost, a silent observer in a world that had once felt so overwhelming. But as the days turned into weeks, the novelty began to wear off. Daniel realized that being invisible came with a price he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't interact with the world in the same way. When he tried to pick up objects, his hands passed through them as if they were made of air. He couldn't eat, couldn't drink, couldn't feel the warmth of the sun on his skin. He was trapped in a liminal space, neither fully alive nor fully dead. Worse still, he began to notice that the living world was slowly fading from his perception. The colors grew duller, the sounds more distant. It was as if he were being pulled further and further away from reality into a shadowy realm that existed just beyond the edges of the living world. He tried to remove the mask again and again, but it was no use. It had become a part of him, its power binding him to this strange half-existence. Desperate for answers, Daniel returned to Eldritch Relics, hoping that Mr. Alaric could help him. But when he entered the shop, the old man didn't seem to notice him. Daniel called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. But Mr. Alaric continued to dust the shelves, his movements slow and deliberate. It was as if Daniel no longer existed to him. Defeated, Daniel left the shop and wandered the city, his invisible form drifting through the crowds. He watched as people laughed, cried, and lived their lives, their presence a painful reminder of what he had lost. He realized now that the mask's power was a curse, a trap that had ensnared him in a world of shadows and silence. As the days passed, Daniel's connection to the living world grew weaker. The city around him became a blur of muted colors and distant sounds, and he felt himself being drawn deeper into the shadowy realm. He began to see other figures there, faint and ghostly, their faces obscured by masks similar to his own. They moved through the shadows like wraiths, their presence a silent testament to the mask's curse. Daniel realized that he was not the first to fall victim to the mask of shadows. The figures he saw were others who had been lured by its promise of invisibility, only to find themselves trapped in this liminal space, their souls bound to the mask for eternity. He tried to speak to them, to find some way to break the curse, but they were as insubstantial as he was, their voices lost in the void. In time, Daniel's memories of his former life began to fade, replaced by the endless monotony of the shadowy realm. He forgot the sound of his own voice, the feel of his own skin. He became one with the mask, his identity swallowed by its darkness. And though he still wandered the city, unseen and unheard, he was no longer Daniel Harper. He was a shadow, a ghost, a whisper in the wind. The mask of shadows remained in Eldritch Relics, its surface gleaming with an eerie light. Mr. Alaric would often gaze at it, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. He knew the mask's power, knew the fate that awaited those who wore it, but he also knew that he could not destroy it, for it was a relic of a forgotten time, a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. And so the mask waited, its power undiminished, its curse unbroken. It called to those who felt invisible, who longed to escape the world and its burdens. But for those who answered its call, there was no return. They became shadows, lost in a realm between life and death, their souls bound to the mask for eternity. In the end, the mask of shadows was not a gift, but a trap, a reminder that the desire to disappear comes at a cost too great to bear. And though its power was great, its true horror lay in the silence it brought, the emptiness it left behind. For those who wore it, there was no escape, no redemption. They were lost, forever unseen, forever unheard, forever trapped in the shadows. Doors are meant to lead somewhere. Doors are meant to be built, to have a purpose. But what about a door that wasn't there before? What about a door that appears without warning, standing alone, waiting? Would you open it? Would you step through? This is the story of a door like that, and the mistake of the person who turned its handle. Elliot lived alone. His apartment was small but comfortable, nestled in an old building that smelled faintly of wood polish and dust. He had lived there for 4 years. He knew every inch of it, every creaky floorboard, every flickering light bulb, every scratch on the walls. So when he woke up one morning and saw a door in his living room where there had never been one before, his blood turned to ice. It was impossible. The wall beside his bookshelf had always been solid brick. There had never been a door there. And yet, There it was, a simple wooden door, a brass handle, no markings, no keyhole, just there, waiting, watching. Elliot's stomach twisted. He didn't open it. Not at first, but the door didn't go away. Elliot tried to ignore it, tried to go about his day as if everything was normal. Maybe he was hallucinating. Maybe he had always had a door there, and somehow his mind was playing tricks on him. He didn't touch it, didn't even go near it. But that night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., there was a knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps from the other side. Knock, knock, knock. Elliot bolted upright in bed. His mouth went dry. His heart thundered. It wasn't possible. It wasn't possible. He lay there frozen, waiting for another knock. But none came. Just silence. Suffocating. Heavy. The kind of silence that listens. The next day, Elliot checked the door again. It was still there. Still impossible. His hand hovered over the handle, hesitant. Then slowly, he turned it. Locked. A breath of relief escaped him. It couldn't be opened. Good. But that night, at 3:12 a.m., the handle turned by itself. Elliot heard it, the soft metallic click as it twisted, but the door did not open. Something was trying to. Something on the other side. Elliot lay in bed, frozen. He knew. It wanted in. Elliot didn't sleep after that. He left the apartment the next morning, stayed out late, tried not to think about the door, tried to convince himself it was a dream. But when he returned home, his stomach dropped. The door wasn't in the living room anymore. It was in the hallway, closer to his bedroom, waiting. That night, Elliot did not turn off the lights, did not close his eyes. But at 3:12 a.m., the door knocked again. And this time, it whispered, a voice soft as wind. Elliot. His name. His name. He squeezed his eyes shut, covered his ears. He did not answer. He did not move. And after a long, unbearable moment, the whisper faded, and the door was gone. But Elliot knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Days passed. The door didn't return. Elliot started to believe it was over. He slept again, laughed again, until the last night, when he woke up and the door was at the foot of his bed, closer than ever, the handle already turning, the lock clicking open. And this time he was not fast enough to stop it. The door swung wide, revealing nothing, a black void, a darkness deeper than anything he had ever seen. And before Elliot could scream, the door pulled him inside. The next tenant moved in 2 weeks later, a young woman named Clara. She loved the apartment. It felt cozy, safe, except for one thing, one small thing. One night, just before she went to sleep, she noticed a door in the living room, one she could have sworn hadn't been there before. And outside, somewhere far, far away, a voice whispered her name. There are some objects that seem ordinary in daylight. A book, a mirror, a toy left on a shelf, a photograph. But at night, in the quiet hours when the world is still, some objects become something else. Some reveal things that were never meant to be seen, and some once found can never be forgotten. This is the story of a photograph, one that never stayed the same, and one that once seen would never stop looking back. The photograph was found by accident. Daniel and his sister, Claire, had spent the afternoon wandering through an old estate sale in a crumbling Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that felt wrong the moment you stepped inside. The walls leaned, the floors creaked. Everything smelled of dust and something faintly rotten. But it was the kind of place that fascinated Claire. She loved old things, forgotten things. So while Daniel waited impatiently near the front door, she wandered. That's when she found the box. It was tucked away in an attic room, beneath a pile of moth-eaten clothes. A small wooden crate, the lid slightly ajar. Inside, dozens of old photographs. Most were black and white, curling at the edges. But one stood out, a faded Polaroid resting at the very bottom. Claire pulled it free, frowning. It was a picture of a house, a simple two-story home, nestled between overgrown trees. The windows were dark. The front porch sagged. But the more she looked at it, the more she felt something, an unease that settled deep in her bones. Something about it was wrong. "Daniel," she called, "look at this." He took the photo, studying it. "It's just a house." "I don't think so," she murmured. She turned the photo over. There was no date, no writing, just the faintest, smudged fingerprint near the corner. Something about it made her shiver. She bought it anyway, and that was her mistake. That night, Claire put the photograph on her nightstand. By daylight, it looked the same, the quiet, abandoned house. Nothing unusual. But that night, something changed. Claire was brushing her teeth when Daniel called her into his room. He was holding the Polaroid, his fingers trembling. "Claire," he said, his voice strangely quiet, "did you mess with this?" She frowned. "What are you talking about?" He turned the photograph toward her. Her stomach dropped. The house was still there. But now one of the upstairs windows was open. A black square, gaping like a mouth. It hadn't been like that before. Claire's words stuck in her throat. "That wasn't like that earlier." "You're sure?" "Positive." They stared at it in silence. Daniel swallowed. "It's just a trick of the light," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Claire nodded, but a cold knot formed in her stomach. Somewhere deep inside her, she knew. It wasn't a trick, and this was only the beginning. The second night, Claire woke up at 2:47 a.m. Her room was dark, silent. Something had pulled her from sleep, but she didn't know what. She sat up slowly, her breath uneven. Then her gaze drifted to her nightstand, to the photograph. Her heart stopped. A light was on in the house. A dim yellow glow spilled from the open upstairs window. Claire's hands turned ice cold. This wasn't possible. She grabbed the Polaroid, her fingers trembling. She had looked at it before bed. She knew the house had been dark. She could feel something watching her now. The picture felt heavy in her hands. Wrong. Claire flipped it over. There was something written on the back, something that hadn't been there before. A single word scrawled in shaking, uneven handwriting. "Hello!" Claire screamed. The next morning, Claire refused to touch the photograph. She wanted to throw it away, burn it. But Daniel hesitated. "What if we just watch it?" he said. "See how it changes." "Are you insane?" Claire snapped. "It wrote something to me." He hesitated. "Just one more night," he said. And against her better judgment, Claire agreed. That night, they set the Polaroid on Daniel's desk. They kept the light on. Every hour they checked it. For the first 3 hours, nothing changed. At 3:12 a.m., Daniel checked again and gasped. Claire bolted upright. "What?" Daniel turned the Polaroid toward her. The light in the window was brighter now, and standing in the glow was a silhouette, a tall, thin figure. Watching them, neither of them slept. By morning, the figure was gone, but the light in the window stayed on. They agreed to get rid of the photograph. Daniel took it outside and buried it deep in the woods. For the first time in days, Claire slept peacefully. Until, at 3:47 a.m., something scratched at her bedroom door. She sat up, her heart hammering. The scratching came again, slow, deliberate. She reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she turned on the flashlight. She took a deep breath and opened the door. Nothing was there, but something was waiting on the floor, just outside her door. The photograph. And now, the figure was no longer in the house. It was standing on the front porch, closer, watching, waiting. Claire and Daniel did everything they could to destroy the photo. They burned it. It didn't burn. They ripped it apart. By morning, it was whole again. And now, the front door of the house in the picture was open, a gaping void inviting something out. That night, they locked their doors, kept every light on. But at exactly 3 a.m., the power went out. The house plunged into darkness. And from the hallway outside their rooms came slow, heavy footsteps. The figure from the photograph wasn't in the picture anymore. It was here, and it was coming for them. There are lanterns that guide the way, lanterns that reveal what the eyes cannot see, and then there are lanterns that show too much. This is the story of one such lantern, a lantern that, when lit, did not just chase away the dark. It revealed what had always been there, and some things are better left unseen. Nathaniel Grayson never intended to buy the lantern. It was an impulse, something he saw in the corner of an antique shop on a rainy evening. The shop had no name. It was one of those places that seemed to appear only when you needed it, tucked away between buildings he could have sworn had never been there before. Inside, the air smelled of dust, wax, and something faintly metallic. The lantern sat on a wooden shelf near the back, its glass dark, its brass frame aged but sturdy. Something about it felt different, not like an antique, like something waiting. The shopkeeper was an old woman with deep wrinkles and eyes that gleamed like candle flames. She watched as Nathaniel picked up the lantern, her expression unreadable. "That one," she murmured. "That one doesn't just light the way, it shows what's hidden." Nathaniel ran his fingers along the cool brass handle. "How much?" The woman gave a small, knowing smile. "For you, just a promise." He frowned. "What kind of promise?" "That you'll never light it in a place you don't wish to see clearly." He hesitated, then nodded. She wrapped the lantern in old newspaper, and as he left, her voice followed him. "Some things stay unseen for a reason, dear." Nathaniel placed the lantern on his bookshelf when he got home. It sat there untouched, collecting dust over the next few weeks. He almost forgot about it, until the power went out. It happened suddenly, plunging his apartment into pitch darkness. Nathaniel fumbled for his phone, but the battery was dead. Then he remembered the lantern. He found an old matchbook in the kitchen drawer, struck a match, and held the flame to the lantern's wick. The moment it caught fire, the room changed. The light wasn't warm. It was pale, flickering, casting long shadows against the walls. But it wasn't just the shadows of his furniture. There were other shadows, shapes that shouldn't be there, figures that had no source. They moved, shifting along the walls, stretching across the floor. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. One of the shadows. It was standing behind him. Nathaniel turned, but nothing was there, only empty air. Yet the shadow on the wall remained, its head tilted, watching. Nathaniel's hands shook. He blew out the lantern. Darkness swallowed the room. His heart thundered in the silence. He stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, barely breathing. And then, a whisper, low, right beside his ear. "I see you now." Nathaniel stumbled backward, hitting the bookshelf. But when he turned the lantern on again, the shadow was gone, for now. The next morning, Nathaniel convinced himself it had been a trick of the light, sleep deprivation, a vivid imagination. But then he saw it, in the mirror, not his reflection, but the other shadow, standing just behind him. It didn't move, didn't shift when he turned around. It just watched. Nathaniel felt sick. He left the apartment, spent the whole day in the city, surrounded by people, by noise, by light. But when he returned home that evening, the lantern was already lit, and the shadows were waiting. Nathaniel tried to destroy the lantern. He threw it against the wall. It didn't break. He tried drowning it in the bathtub. The flame didn't go out. He buried it in his closet under piles of blankets. Yet every night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the lantern would be lit and the shadows would be closer. He stopped sleeping, stopped staying in his apartment after dark. But the lantern wasn't bound to the apartment anymore. It followed him, reflected in the glass of store windows, flickering in alleyways when he walked home, its glow just barely visible, even when it wasn't there. And the shadows, they were always watching, waiting, growing closer. Nathaniel knew he couldn't escape it. He had made a mistake. He had lit the lantern where he shouldn't have, and now the unseen had seen him. He didn't know what would happen if they reached him, but he didn't want to find out. So on the final night, he did the only thing left. He lit the lantern one last time. This time, he didn't look away. The shadows poured from the walls. They grew solid, shifting toward him. One reached out, long fingers stretching toward his face. The moment it touched him, the light went out. Nathaniel screamed. And then, silence. When the neighbors found his apartment the next day, Nathaniel was gone. The lantern sat cold on the floor, its wick untouched. And on the walls, the shadows remained, still, watching and waiting for someone else to light the lantern and let them in. Weeks later, the antique shop appeared again. A different city, a different street. The old woman sat behind the counter waiting, and in the back, on a dusty wooden shelf, the lantern waited too. And it would wait until the next curious soul found it and lit the flame. Some places exist only when the world is asleep. Some roads are meant to be forgotten. This road is neither. It is always there, waiting in the space between dreams and memory. A long stretch of cracked pavement, shrouded in mist. It does not lead to a city. It does not lead to home. It leads to something else. And once you have walked it, even in sleep, it will never stop calling you back. Because the road does not simply exist in nightmares. The road is the nightmare. And eventually, it will become your reality. The first time Isaac Montgomery saw the road, he thought it was just a dream. A strange, unsettling dream, but nothing more. He had been standing on pavement, his breath fogging in the cold air. The road stretched ahead into thick mist, the edges vanishing into darkness. There were no signs, no streetlights, no sound except for the faintest whisper of wind. Then, the footsteps, not his own, not echoing. Something else was there, something watching. He had turned his head and woke up before he could see it. Most nightmares fade with the morning light. This one didn't. All day, the memory of that road clung to Isaac's mind. Something about it felt too real. The way the air had been so cold, it bit at his skin. The way the silence had pressed in around him. The way the footsteps had stopped just before he turned. That night, when he closed his eyes, the road was waiting. The same stretch of pavement, the same fog curling at the edges. Only this time, the silence was deeper. The air was thicker, and he could feel it now. The presence just beyond the mist. Something just out of sight. Something waiting. He tried to move, tried to step forward, but the moment his foot touched the ground, the whispering began, faint, distant, but growing closer. Isaac turned, his heart pounding. Something moved in the fog, a shadow stretching toward him, and then he woke up. Isaac sat up in bed, gasping. His sheets were damp with sweat. His room was dark, silent, but something felt off. His feet were cold. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and froze. The floor wasn't carpet, it was pavement. He yanked his feet back onto the bed, his breath sharp. He forced himself to look again. The carpet was there. The room was normal. But for a few terrifying seconds, it hadn't been. Isaac didn't sleep the rest of the night. But the next night, the dream came back. This time, when Isaac stepped onto the road, he felt heavier, like something was pulling him down. The air was colder than before. The fog had thickened. And then he saw it, a signpost standing by the roadside. It hadn't been there before. It was old, the wood warped and splintered. And though the sign itself was blank, there were deep scratches in the wood. Scratches that looked almost like letters. Isaac stepped closer, his fingers hovering over the rough surface. Something about it called to him. He touched it. Pain lanced through his skull. Visions. A woman running, breathless, desperate, something chasing her. A scream, then darkness. Isaac yanked his hand away, his own breath ragged. And when he looked again, the scratches on the sign had changed. Now they formed a single word. Run! Isaac spun around, his pulse hammering. The road stretched endlessly in both directions. The fog swirled unnaturally, curling toward him like living hands. And then, the whispering started again, louder this time. He's here now. He's walking the road. He should not have stayed this long. Isaac's breath turned to ice. The whispers were close, too close. Shapes moved in the mist, tall, thin, not quite human. One of them stepped forward. Isaac turned and ran. His feet pounded against the pavement. The road stretched into eternity. No turns, no exits. Only the endless, suffocating fog. Behind him, the whispers grew louder. The shapes moved faster. The road felt wrong beneath his feet. Like it wasn't solid. Like it was shifting, changing. Isaac ran harder. Then, a door. Standing alone in the middle of the road. A way out. He reached for the handle. Something grabbed his wrist. A voice rasped in his ear. You don't get to leave. Isaac yanked free, threw the door open, and everything went black. Isaac's eyes snapped open. His room, his bed, his heart still racing. But as he sat there gasping, the room felt different. Too quiet, too still. Then he noticed. His window was covered in fog, a thick, unnatural mist swirling against the glass. His breath caught in his throat. And then he saw the reflection, a signpost, standing in the middle of his room. Scratched into the wood was a new message. You never left. Isaac turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just his empty room. But the fog outside the window was getting thicker, and from the hallway beyond his bedroom door, he heard it, a single, slow footstep. The road hadn't just followed him into his dreams. It had followed him into the waking world. And now, it was waiting for him to walk it again.